and because I'd read
McQuarrie. I was known as Alec, A-L-E-C, but that's what I was known as, Alec. I was working at a bank in Yorkton when the war started, and the Yorkton field was being built when I was there. They started from scratch, and then they got the pavement down and started flying and training, and also they had their bank account in the bank branch that I was working in, and so I became acquainted to a certain degree with the Air Force, and they got interested in enlisting, and there was an office in Yorkton where they interviewed chaps wanting to make the move, and so I did that part, and then I went to Regina for being admitted and sworn in, and medical and all those sort of things, and is this okay? Then my first posting was to Penhold, Alberta, which was just a couple of grain elevators and a small station, but there was a field there, and it was being expanded, and it was a temporary manning depot, and from there, we learned, we're trained in marching and Air Force law and recognition, aircraft recognition, and so on. But mostly it was just marching and getting that sort of thing out of the way.
How long were you there, Alec?
About a month.
And this would have been, do you remember the date that you arrived there?
Oh, I have them down in writing, but I can't.
Do you remember the month vaguely?
I arrived there in May, and it'd be June. I went to, the next posting was a field called Claresholm in Alberta. And
let's go back to Manning Depot for a minute. How did you handle all this sudden discipline and the lack of privacy? Did you adjust okay?
Oh, yes. Actually, I had a little bit of experience in the non-permanent militia in Yorkton, and while I was in that, it was 64th Field Battery, and I went to Saskatoon for 3 weeks of courses on, that was the Army, so I got some experience in marching and so on with that.
So at Manning Depot, were there men from all over the country there?
Yes, and a few Americans too. Because at a time, there was one period when about 10% of enlistments in the RCAF were from the USA. So we had a few Americans there, and that's all, no other nationalities.
So the average day was spent in marching and drills. Did you do any, did they put you through any testing of any sort at that point at Manning Depot?
No.
No?
No.
And what about inoculations? Did you get lots of shots?
Not so much. I don't remember getting shots there. We probably did, but I don't really recall having any sore arms or anything like that.
No. Do you remember the food?
Yeah, the food was all right. I think it was a little better than what I got in Saskatoon. And we had a certain amount of discipline, but there were very little problems. We had get off duty at noon on Saturday, and start up again on Monday. So it was fun going to the towns nearby, like Red Deer, and then the Sylvan Lake, where there was a great place to be on the weekend. And there was jitney dancing and things like that. So a good way to get to meet people. And then there were Army people from other training areas in Alberta. They'd come to the lake, and so.
How would you get there, Alec? Did you take a bus? Did they ship you there? Not ship, but was there a bus line you could take, or
From
Manning Depot to Red Deer?
we'd hitchhike.
You'd hitchhike?
Mostly, yeah. In fact, on Saturday morning after we turned loose, we would walk out to the number 2 highway. If you were wanting to go to Edmonton, you would walk south, because you'd get ahead of the others in getting a car, getting picked up. And then if you were going to Calgary, you would walk north and look out for a ride. And all the people were very good to us. And there was a batch of RAF ground crew came there, because this field was being turned over to the RAF for training, sending trainees from Britain to Canada. So they moved in when we were being moved out, sort of thing. So they had to send us elsewhere.
So where did you go from Penhold?
Went to Claresholm in Alberta for guard duty. And that was kind of a fill-in time too, but we had to have an area around the airfield, the buildings and so on, where we would patrol. We'd carry a rifle and with no shells. And that was it 4 on and 2 off or something like that? I just forget now. And around the clock. So and we got some time offs for weekends and so on, and did a lot of more hitchhiking, and I got to see a lot of Alberta, and I really enjoyed Alberta, and I even got up to the mountains and down to the border, Waterton Lakes and places like that. Just a great time.
Now, was this ITS school, or were you still waiting at this point?
Still waiting
You're
for
still waiting.
wireless school.
Oh, to wireless school.
Yeah, and that turned out to be Winnipeg.
Okay.
Whereas some of the other fellows that I was in Manning Depot with, got to know them pretty good. They ended up in Calgary and went to Calgary wireless school. Anyway, so we went by train from Claresholm to Calgary to Winnipeg to the Deaf and Dumb School. It was taken over by the Air Force for training air gunners. And they had set up huts and so on, that the regular ones you may be familiar with. H huts, they call them, or there'd be 2 buildings joined with washrooms in between and that sort of thing.
So what was your training like? What kind of courses did you take?
Well, we had to learn the code, to use the code,
Morse code?
Morse code, and we had to learn to do it to a certain speed, and you learn to do it with flags, and we had a little training out at the field in Winnipeg.
Is that where you did gunnery exercises?
No, we just went out to Winnipeg to the flying field there, and went out in small planes and practiced our radios. Didn't get a great deal of it, just an inkling into it. But there were, there was some New Zealanders, a draft of them came to Winnipeg to the wireless school. So that was an interesting time with them. They're great
What were
guys.
they like?
Oh, they were just a lot of fun, and they were, of course, they had an accent that they had trouble with our accent. We had trouble with theirs too. Not really trouble, but we made good friends with them, and they were well accepted in the city of Winnipeg.
Would this have been in the fall already, Alec? Do you remember?
This was in late, became into winter.
It was becoming
So we
winter.
were in Winnipeg when the Japanese bombed and started the war from their end. So
So how did the winter affect your training? Did it make life more difficult?
well, not really, because we were all, except for maybe the New Zealanders and some Americans who would find a little, but we had good warm clothing and mitts and so on, and there was no problem that way. It didn't interrupt our training.
So how long did wireless school go? Do you remember how long you were there training?
That's where I would like to have had my little sheet of paper.
Where did you go next from wireless school?
We went to Dafoe in Saskatchewan, which was just a couple of grain elevators and a small station, and the flying field had been established there, and there were people trained, pilots and instructors and so on.
Was it an EFTS school, Alec? or
No.
SFTS?
No, it was a bombing and gunnery.
It was bombing and gunnery.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we had to go up in a plane and shoot at drogues. There'd be a plane holding a drogue, and then you'd get in this plane, and the bullets would have colors on them, and you'd you could tell how good you were by the marks on the drogues. So that was a bit of fun too.
Do you remember how you did?
Pardon me?
How did you do at shooting?
Oh, I don't remember. I don't remember any figures or anything like that, but I don't remember being any, how would you say, a top liner or anything like that. But,
Must have done okay, though. Do you remember your first flight up?
actually, my first flight in the Air Force was in Claresholm. I ran into a fellow there that was on course. He was from Yorkton. I knew him quite well. So I asked him one day, how about getting a ride? He said, sure, come on. I'm going up now. An instructor's taking me up. So that was my first flight in the RCAF. So,
How'd you do? Did you get sick at all, or were you okay?
oh no,
Is that all right?
I don't think I ever got sick in the Air Force.
Good record.
I never lost my breakfast.
So what was the average day like at Bombing and Gunnery School? Did you spend a lot of time up in the air?
No, very little actually.
Was it mostly?
We went out on the lake, and they set up machine guns and targets, and the lake was frozen, of course, and so that was a good experience too. And
What were the instructors like?
oh, they were all gung ho. They were trying to do the best for us. And
All RCAF personnel? Were there any civilian instructors there?
no civilians. And there were some RAF people drifting in, you know. They were being, someone left off here and there depending on their experience and so on.
Did
So
a lot of your classmates from Winnipeg come to Dafoe, or not so?
no, we had them from BC through to the Lakehead. There was a scattering of them.
And men from other countries there as well?
No, just Brit,
Just
and not many of them there. So we went from that. When we finished there, we got our before we get out of the Winnipeg, reading, we got our sparks for when we were awarded our sparks for when we passed. And then we went to Dafoe. When we passed there, we got sergeant stripes. And some did. Most got, then there would be some were picked for commissions if they were very excellent in all the requirements. So from Dafoe, that went on embarkation leave, and
Graduated,
yeah.
and then you had to wait.
Well, we had enough time to go home for about 3 weeks. And
Was that your first trip home since you had started training?
no, when we were in Winnipeg, my hometown was Rainy River,
Oh,
and I managed to get down there for a couple of weekends, and got down by freight train and things like that. And
long train trips.
it's about 6 hours from Winnipeg to Rainy River.
No,
So.
that's not too bad.
Yeah.
Do you remember what graduation was like, Alec? Do you remember the day?
No, I don't remember the day. We had quite a party in the mess, and of course there was a bit of beer available and things like that, and we had officers in, and that were it was part of the routine. And padres were there, and things.
Do you remember if any of the community came to watch the graduation?
No, I don't remember. There was no community. There was a so-called town just outside the gates of the flying field, and that was called Boomtown. And that's not official, but everybody referred to it as Boomtown. And there were a few tar paper shacks there, and civilians living and working on the field. and some cases they had their children there, and so there wasn't much nightlife for sure.
What did you do at the school for fun then? Did you have any time to have fun?
Oh, we just spend time in the mess, and sometimes there were shows, and there were towns that were worth. If you had enough of a weekend, you could go and spend some time there. So
after graduation, you went home and awaited word of where you would be posted?
we had been given a time about what, and then so that we had to get the train from Rainy River, went to Cottesmore, Ontario by bus, and got the train and went right through to Montreal, and had 2 or 3 days there, then another train right to Halifax. I had a brother and his wife were living in Montreal at the time. He was 10 years older than me, so he wasn't being enlisted. So had a little time with them there.
Managed to have a visit.
And
What were you feeling at the time, Alec? Were you excited about going overseas?
oh yes,
Yeah. Was everybody in general excited about that?
oh yeah, they were anxious to get over. And for the most part, anyway, as far as I know, none of them turned around or disappeared.
So at Halifax, you did you go on a ship overseas?
Yeah, we spent several weeks there because we had to wait for large passenger ships to take us on.
Right.
So you just had to wait until they came in, and then away you went. And I went on a French ship called Ile de France,
Oh,
and
was it a nice ship?
pardon me, it wasn't. It was Ile de France was coming home.
Oh.
A ship Batory. There was a ship called the Batory. It was a Polish ship, and we had reasonable conditions and food and so on, and so.
Was it a rough ride over? Was the boat taking an evasive course as you made your way?
Oh yes. Yeah.
Did anyone get sick that you knew?
I'm sure there were some sick, but luckily I never got sick. And there were times when we heard explosions, and that would you hear that hitting, not hitting the metal, but it would carry the sound, and that was a little caused some concern.
I guess so. So you were quite close to action at some times.
At that time, yeah.
Do you remember how long it took to get over it?
I think it was 2 or 3 weeks. And we landed in Scotland. And then we went by train from Scotland right down to the south coast of England. And it was called, no, it was a receiving center for the RCAF and other New Zealanders and Aussies and so on. So we had a bit of training there, just marching and so on, but not too much. Because there were so many of us, the place was plugged. And this is where the training in Canada started to pile up. They were putting out so many graduate students and so on. So
you had to wait for a while there.
Had to wait there for a while, and it was a very nice place. It was the ocean was right there, and the Air Force was allowed through a barricade to go into the water. No civilians could go in. So that was kind of a treat. And
were you with anyone you had trained with?
yes.
You were. Quite a few?
Oh, number-wise, you know, we actually got started getting scattered from Manning Depot and then catching up with fellows, you know, like the fellows that went to Calgary Wireless School and fellows from Winnipeg and so on. We would meet up again.
So where were you posted eventually? Were you posted in England somewhere to?
Well, I went for one into Wales to a school for radio radio training to be. I'm not coming out with the right words, you know. But anyway, we had a few weeks there, and that was a nice area. We got to the sea, out to the sea on a weekend by train, and then we were transferred to OTU, Operational Training Unit, and which is carrying on training and on the subjects we trained on. And this, they had a plane called, just a minute ago, I'm going to tell you.
Type of plane that you would have been on?
Yeah.
Were you on Halifax's by any chance?
No, these were much older planes and smaller two-engine jobs, and we would go up on them and take navigators up for their experience, and Hampdens. The name of the plane was a Hampden, and they were a bit ancient, but they did the job. So, and then we went from there. After we finished that course, we were sent to a place called Topcliffe, and we were to form. That's it became a Canadian station. That was in December. Then on the 1st of January, 6th Group, the Canadian Bomber Command Group, came into being. So we were attached to Canadian squadrons. And the one I was attached to was 424. And we took training on Pardon me?
I'm wondering if I can help you. Are you thinking of the name of the plane you were on?
Yes. It's a big two-engine,
Was it bullfighters?
no,
No. I should stop guessing. I'm not helping.
oh, this is embarrassing.
No, it's okay.
Uh,
Tell me about how often you were up in the air training. Maybe bit by bit it will come to you then.
yeah.
So was every day sort of
It was a bomber, and it would carry a fairly big load, even though it just two engines on it.
How many crew?
5 in the crew, sometimes 1 or 2 more, depending on what the situation was. And after a period of training and low-level stuff and over the ocean, and just offshore, and the navigators got a lot of training on this, on flight navigators and pilots for night flying, and going on courses. They'd be given a target and they'd fly to that, and then find their way back and under. And my wife could tell me.
Where is she? Do you remember, Alec, how long you trained before you started doing operations? It sounds like you were there for a fair bit and had plenty of opportunities.
The trouble at this, the 424 at Thorncliffe was the station, and we had to wait for planes, and, so that some of the planes we had were earlier editions, and then we started getting newer ones and newer, and
That's okay. You know what? Why don't I do a new one? Wouldn't that be a help at this point?
yes, sir.
So you know some of this stuff?
Is it Wellington? you're on?
Wellington, yeah.
For heaven's sakes.
Just wouldn't come.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Bit of a mental block. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you were flying in a Wellington.
Yeah, and we start going operational,
Huh?
and
Remember your first?
yeah, it was bombing the pens on the shore in France. What's the ships, the underground?
Submarine pens.
The submarine pens. They were being serviced and repaired and things like that. So they were, having a very bad time in the North Atlantic at that time because of all of the submarines were taking giving the Allies a bad time, and so that had the tour. I think it was 3 trips to that area, and then we had one to Hamburg and some other places in Germany.
Were they mostly during the night, Alec, or a day race?
Yeah, all nights. We also had to go into the North Sea to drop and to try and hit shipping, German shipping. It was trying to get from the North Sea around into the Atlantic and things like that. So read some of that, and some of the other big cities.
Did you spend most of, were most of these trips in the same plane? Were you always flying in the same plane,
No.
your crew?
Well, all the same crew, yes, but
Right. But you changed planes?
not always the same plane. They tried to keep you on one, but sometimes you'd go and leave or something, come back, and somebody else has got your plane. So that thing was natural and normal. So we had one that it was the letter on it was G, and so we were starting to get pictures on our aircraft, you know. And you come up with an idea, and an artist would, and we came up with one. G was Gallopin' Gertie, so the artist came up with a pretty good one for that. And
how many missions did Gertie fly? Any idea?
we had 9, and we were shot down on the 9th.
Tell me about that night. What happened?
That was on Stuttgart, and we bombed the target. We're on our way back to England to go over France and so on, and everything seemed to be all right. And then all of a sudden there was an explosion in the back of the aircraft, and the aircraft went into a terrible dive, and it just felt as though this is it. And the pilot was able to fight it out of the dive and got it going on course. But there were 3 wounded. The bomb aimer had been in the upper part of the plane scouting for fighter planes, and then the navigator was in his position. He got a bit of wound in his body. The navigator got cannon shell through his arm, and the rear gunner got a cannon shell through his the lower part of his leg, and the plane caught fire. These planes were fabric covered, and this plane caught fire just outside of the rear gunner's turret, and he managed to pull himself out of the turret and got his air parachute and pulled the parachute in the aircraft and smothered the fire. And that allowed us to keep going. Otherwise, we would have been wiped out by the fire. The rear gunner was awarded the DFM for that action. The pilot, we were still going when the pilot was having a terrible time keeping the aircraft going because he's losing different things in it that required him to keep the aircraft in the air. And finally it came to a point where he decided that he wasn't going to be able to keep it going, and we're heading towards to the ocean, somewhere near, not knowing where we were really. but as it turned out, it was somewhere in the Calais area. So the pilot with 3 wounded on board elected to have one of the wounded, the bomb aimer, bail out while he went out over water and then come back in and made a wheels-up landing on the beach. And he made a real good landing. We teased him afterwards. He said they did a better jobbing in that landing than he used to do when he landed at our flying field, training field and so on. And that was just a joke. So we were able to get the 2 wounded out of the aircraft and tried to make them comfortable. And we could hear Germans in the area, and they finally came in and took over. They had called an ambulance in and took the wounded away. And they went and picked up the bomb aimer. He'd fallen and he made a good landing with his parachute and went to a farmhouse, and he was picked up immediately. And so a German ambulance came and took all 3 of them and took them to a hospital somewhere. So the pilot and I were taken into we were turned over to a couple of German Army officers who were ready for a leave, and so they were in charge of us to take us to Germany, and it was there that we were put in a camp. That was you were to be quizzed and so on like that, and you had to there was in the room I was in, we were segregated in 1 room, and I remember seeing on the wall with a pinprick name, number, and rank. That's all you were to give. So we tried to abide by that.
How long were you there?
A couple of weeks there. Got some clothing we needed. They had some Brit clothing, like some Army clothing, some Air Force. And then we went when they got quite a few in there, they had to get them out and make room for the next batch. And so we went by train, not very fancy, just wooden chairs and so on. We had we were all in one car and taken to a camp called Barth at Luft 1. It was right close to the North Sea. So I think, how are you doing here?
We need to wrap it up. I don't
Yeah.
need to wrap it up. Well, do you remember what the date was that you were taken as a POW?
No, not really.
And you were there till the end of the war? How long were you there, Alec? Were you there till the end of the war?
As a POW?
Yeah.
Oh, we went to different camps, like one
Right.
in Lithuania and Poland, and so it was 2 years.
Wow.
Huh.
And then you were liberated to...
Yeah.
What happened? Did Allied troops just show up one day?
We had been on a march from camp in Poland, and then another one in Germany, and because they were moving us west because the Russians were coming from the east, and they didn't want the Russians to get hold of us because we were a bargaining chip, you might say, with the between the Germans and the Allies. So we got on the march, and then eventually got into an area where the Allies had occupied.
Amazing story. I'm sorry I have to cut us off.
Yeah.
We should continue it on audio. Thank you, Alec, for talking with us. Stay there and I'll get your mic from you. Oh, oops. You know, that's something we could do, is we could